Hello and welcome to Crossover. I'm your host Tegan Cantrell, an intern here at LTC. And today our guests, Dr. Robert Forrant and Dr. Jose Mendoza, are back to discuss immigration again. We had so much to talk about last time, and we have a lot more to talk about today. So we got into a lot of really interesting ideas last time, and I think the conversation was kind of heading in a certain direction. And I want to start off by talking about power, and then later on moving on toward the topics of justice and freedom. To sort of stimulate discussion about power, because the word power is not a question. What rights do those in power have over others, and when does the force of governance infringe upon our inalienable rights or our human rights, regardless of citizenship?
Take it, philosopher.
Okay. I mean, so maybe I'll back up a little bit. I mean, I think before that's kind of, I think it's going to get us closer to justice in some sense. I think the question about power is kind of interesting. Assuming that something or an immigration system is wrong, how do you actually change it? One thing we can do is we can start talking about, well, what really motivates people is appealing to their sort of moral intuitions and say, look, this is a violation of human rights, so we should change our immigration policy. And I think this is kind of the story we tell ourselves about the UN Convention on like refugees, the right to exit. We say, look at what happened in World War II. This was bad. Therefore, we should change our sort of global governance on migration, so that, you know, if you want to exit a state, say East Germany or the Soviet Union, you should have the right to exit. If someone's seeking asylum, say, you know, you're Jewish and you're fleeing concentration camps, states should have a responsibility to take you in. But I think the question about power is really about, well, that's all well and good, and we see these situations throughout the world, lots of stateless folks who should be given refuge and so on and so forth, and yet there's very powerful states who just refuse to do it. What's the thing that's going to force people to do this? Protests, perhaps, or what are the actual levers that we can pull to make people do this? And so as I said, one thing we can argue is, well, what motivates people is they don't want to be on the wrong side of history. But I guess I'm a little skeptical if that really is what motivates people. And maybe this will I'll pass it off to the historian. Historically, what do you think has made people change their immigration policy, though?
I think in the case of the United States, where immigration policy changes after a quota system is put in place, and again, thinking about power and Congress shaping immigration laws and quota systems, and we fail as a nation in the 1930s to exhibit any sort of moral courage to take in people trying to flee from Hitler and Nazi Germany. After the Second World War and into the 50s and early 60s, we're stuck with, we being the United States, not me personally, we're stuck with a harsh immigration policy which the Soviet Union uses to embarrass us in the world. The Soviet Union says to the world at large, you know, don't be fooled by the United States. They claim they're for equal rights and human rights and civil rights. Look at how they treat African Americans at home, and look at as well how they deny admittance into the United States from all these different places in the world, including Asian countries as well as African countries. And we begin to modify President Johnson, and then of all people who we think of as the conservative paean of America, Ronald Reagan, they changed the immigration laws in the country. They changed the distributions of where people can come from, not out of any moral and or ethical sort of hugging of the world, but because they're being embarrassed on the world stage and it's infringing on what they want their posture to be in the world. And so I think while I agree, I agree that we ought to have a moral, ethical policy with respect to immigrants and refugees, I mean, in my reading of American history, we never have.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. It's like, well, morals aren't really driving our immigration policies. So like, well, if that's not the point of an immigration policy, what is the point of an immigration policy? You've mentioned how we're selective about who we let in and who we don't let in, and then that that doesn't that compound into like stereotypes about different groups of people and all, like what's the root of all that? What's the point of having an immigration policy if it's not about, you know, like ethnicity?
So I think it is a sort of complicated story, and I think what you're asking is, I think it's good. We need some history in this too. But nation states again are fairly new, and how we define who's a member of the nation has a lot to do with the immigration policy that we adopt. So a lot of the early 20th century immigration policies that Professor Forrant was talking about go back and look at a census of 1890. They look at what was America like in 1890, and they say that's what America was really like. And so they design immigration policies from that and put quotas to try to reflect that distribution.
That's interesting. So like, but is that the way that we should, you know, impose our cultural makeup on the United States? Like that begs the question. Like, is that right?
I don't think so. So now we should start maybe talk about a little bit about justice. Like what does justice look like? What would a just immigration policy look like? And I think part of this has to do with, well, why are people moving? What's attracting them to the certain states they're moving to? And what caused them to get dislocated? When you talk to most people actually aren't itching to leave. Some people are. You know, you think of, we're in Lowell now, so you think of Kerouac on the road. Some people just itch to get out there and move around and be cosmopolitan, see the world. But most immigrants become immigrants because they're displaced. And they go to places where they're going to find work, or there's an attraction to that. And I think we can come up with a system to accommodate all of these folks, where they don't have to do this clandestinely. They can do this through the quote-unquote proper channels. And that, I think, is much more ethical. So I think what we need is what a just immigration policy would be is a much more humanitarian policy.
Okay, so like what is the immigration situation now, and how's it different than different, let's say like immigration crises or dilemmas or something. In the public discourse, currently immigration is a really hot issue, and it seems to be, at least to some people, like it's some kind of crisis. So how does that compare to other points in history where immigration has caused sort of inflammation in culture?
So you can take the case of Lowell as a good example. In the 1840s and 1850s in Lowell, the immigration debate is we're letting in too many Catholics, and we're especially letting in too many Catholics from Ireland. And so there's a group of people in Massachusetts and Lowell who are trying to figure out how to restrict and disallow Catholics from coming into the city. As Lowell is growing as a city, for a while there's a system of government in place in Lowell that says if you're Irish Catholic, you can't live in Lowell. You can work in Lowell during the week, but then as far as a permanent residence, you have to walk back to Charlestown, just outside of Boston, and then you can come back again on Monday. And then eventually we say, well, that's economically inefficient. We're losing all that labor time by making people walk back and forth between Lowell and Charlestown on Friday and Monday. So we'll give you a little bit of land over in what becomes the Lowell Acre. Subsequent to that, French-Canadian waves of immigration come in, and the same thing happens. And now it's, well, the French-Canadians won't learn English. And so they're immediately suspect, because not only are they Catholic, but they won't learn English. And they're not all that interested initially in becoming citizens. They keep going back and forth between here and Canada. I mean, ultimately, for me at least, as a historian thinking about immigration, a lot of immigration policy, a lot of the sort of visceral reaction to immigration is based on religion, race, ethnicity, however you want, you know.
Just like people being different.
And yeah, I mean, different language, skin tone, whatever, right? But that underneath it all, what also drives immigration policy, and always has in this country, is economics. And we've, especially in the border between us and Mexico, between us and Caribbean, we've always invited people in when there were labor shortages and expelled them when the labor shortage passed. And so our history of treating people badly, you could take the Chinese immigrants who come into the country during the gold rush and to build a railroad. As soon as the work is done, let's figure out every possible way we can to expel them from the country. once we create this false border, I think, between us and Mexico, then we bring people in, bring people out, especially around world wars. When we have a labor shortage and we need people to do agricultural work. Let's invite several 100,000 Mexicans in on work visas and through other avenues. Then when the crisis is over, whether some of those folks are in fact citizens or are actually born here, we just round everybody up and expel them again. And so there's nothing, for me again, on the surface we dress it up to be about some of these visceral reactions that we can get. But really, historically, what has driven immigration policy, the way I think about it, is big business, is access to workers, is trying to create a cheap workforce where you can pit one group against another group. And businesses love that. That's why we're in the tangle we're in today.
So immigrants are a commodity.
Absolutely.
Economically.
I think that's really, I mean, to me, no, they're people. But the way
the economy
the way we manipulate the border, not a border, come in, go out, who can come in, who can't.
Okay.
They are absolutely a commodity.
So that seems a little unjust because people aren't commodities, but we're treating certain people like they're commodities based on their status as citizens or non-citizens or available labor that you can get more cheaply. So is that devaluation in some way, against the spirit of human rights or in direct violation of human rights?
Yes, I think so. And it's hard to sort of pinpoint who's responsible. So I don't really think there's people in a dark, smoky room sort of coming up with this conspiracy.
Yeah.
But you have all of these things sort of culminate such that we have a particular kind of immigration system that allows, from the outside it looks pretty generous. You allow about 1 million immigrants in a year. But there are particular kinds of immigrants and particular kinds of labor gets special visas and others don't get visas. And yet there's still a demand for this labor and these folks are willing to do it. And the problem then is you get these folks who come and they have no workers' protections. That's where you start getting the violations of human rights. People who are working don't get paid minimum wage. Mm-hmm. Sometimes don't get paid at all. And absolutely, we seem to want them as just labor. We have this rhetoric. Some people have this rhetoric, this sort of pro-life rhetoric, and yet when it comes to immigrant women, you think of them as you hear the terms like their kids are anchor babies or something like that, and they want to deny them prenatal care and this sort of stuff. The sort of things that if it's any other person,
we could totally get into a discussion
right?
about.
We can't. So, but I'll give you the example. We're even because we can fuss over what we think of as human rights, but even when we find someone, say, who takes a pro-life stance,
yeah.
and they say this is what I think is a human right. Damn it, the fetus is a human and they have rights, but it's only a particular kind of fetus now. It's not this other fetus, right? So there's a sense where the border itself. We keep this human rights rhetoric, and yet for certain people, once they cross the border, being who they are, it's like they magically fall outside the realm of people who we should really care about their human rights.
Yeah.
And that is strange to me.
Because that's not that's not the definition of human rights.
It's not, but notice the language we use. I think a lot of this comes to anchor baby, criminal alien, illegal alien, narco-terrorist, right? We use these sort of dehumanizing terms, and I don't think it's an accident, because I do think ultimately, when you talk to a lot of people, most people are good people. They don't want to violate people's human rights. So you almost have to have this kind of cognitive separation between these other
folks.
folks.
It would create cognitive dissonance.
There you go.
Yeah. So, what is justice anyway? What is justice? There's justice, okay, I'll lay it out. There's justice with a capital J,
yeah.
So the abstract concept of absolute justice. And then we have justice that happens in a courtroom. And then we have justice that happens in a courtroom that's about immigration. Now, how are those things different? What are they and how are they different?
That's a big question. I mean, I think at this point we live in a world of states that claim to be liberal states.
Yeah.
And by that they say, look, all people have certain inalienable freedoms or rights, and we need to give everyone equal moral consideration. And so the question was, what does that mean? What is giving people equal moral consideration? Well, the one thing that liberal states want to avoid is having things like serfs and princes and kings anymore. And yet it still seems that we have a certain status that we get the moment we're born. You're born, and whatever your parents were, wherever you were born, you're given a citizenship, or in some cases not given a citizenship, and that sort of sticks with you for the rest of your life and overdetermines your life chances. That seems unfair. But working within that system, then we talk about what does it mean to have your day in court? Well, imagine any other sort of violation you have that's going to seriously impact your life. Don't you think you have a right to an attorney? I think most people do. Turns out that in immigration court, you don't. You don't have a right to an attorney. You expect to have all these sort of protections that you get in a criminal case, but yet you don't have these protections in an immigration case, because an immigration case is not seen as a criminal case. And yet it still has these sort of dramatic impacts.
It's still being treated like a crime in everything but name?
It's being treated sort of like a parking ticket, and yet we enforce it with the same sort of way that we would enforce any other, homicide or
felony,
grand theft auto, right? And exactly, you have guards with guns and so forth. This isn't like an unpaid parking ticket, yet those are the kinds of protections you're given. So it's a kind of give and take. Immigration court is very different. It's partly very different also because it's not under, it's not technically under the judicial branch. So that's kind of strange. So you've got the three branches of government. Immigration court is actually under the executive branch. So it's this strange situation where the person who enforces the law is also the person who picks the judges and tries the
jury
cases.
And executioner.
Exactly. And so it's a very strange situation because most people would think, well, this is a court, so it's under the judicial branch, but it's absolutely not under the judicial branch. It's actually under the executive branch.
That's creepy. That just makes me think of like military rule or whatever.
It does. And again, but for some things, I think we're not as upset. We're not as upset about this when it comes to something like parking tickets because
it's not us, it's them.
And yeah, it's the losses. The loss is pretty small.
Yeah.
Being deported, having you being separated from your kids, all the consequences that come from the way we enforce immigration law are very serious. And you would think that if it's got these sorts of serious consequences, what justice would require is that at least you get minimal protections. And even now what we're doing by having this policy where we're forcing asylum seekers to stay in Mexico, we're doing that because we've signed conventions saying if someone comes and claims asylum, we have to at least hear them out. And we're saying, well, we just don't even have the time to listen to your case. We don't even have the 5 minutes to listen to you make your case for asylum. So we're going to keep you at arm's length. Because the moment you step onto U.S. soil, we've now signed all these treaties that sort of force us to at least listen to your case.
You mentioned asylum, and that is very different when someone is fleeing their home under duress to another place seeking asylum. That's very different than somebody looking for a work visa. So we're very willing to accept people who are going to contribute to our GDP or our personal gain. But we're not willing to help people who are in dire need, who need help the most, or unable, perhaps.
And some of it is the fact that not only do we not want to try to think that through and figure out, okay, refugees and asylees, how do we figure that question out in terms of who gets in or not, but we also, as a nation, discount all the history that leads up to the fact that several millions of people are living in refugee camps and or hundreds of thousands of people in Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, places like that, are living in fear for their lives to some degree as a consequence of American foreign policy and American business interests. And so the numbers of people living in refugee camps in the Middle East as a consequence of the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and as well in Northern Africa, and again, what's happening in Central America, I mean, as a historian, if I want to figure out, well, why are so many of these people sort of now in this predicament, the majority of refugees in the world are in a predicament that there's a historical explanation. And it's got something to do with either some European countries' foreign policy misadventures or, again, in my opinion, historically, some misadventures or foreign policy, just really horrible decisions that we've made as a country. And so going back to what's ethical, moral, however we want to think about justice, we have, again, I think, a responsibility. And what's happening now is we're saying no. And it's fascinating that, I mean, we're talking now in April of 2019. Just a few days ago, the president talked about, in a speech, the country's full, right? Well, the same rhetoric was used, the exact same phraseology that he used in his speeches was used to deny Jewish refugees coming into the United States in the 1930s. The exact same language was used. And Congress was asked then to bend the quota system to let more people in. And the argument back was, we're sorry, we're full. No room at the inn. And yeah, that's an ironic play on religious words there. And so here we are, right? And so here we sit again with that same logic, and where again the crisis in the 30s, foreign policy, European foreign policy, the legacies of the First World War create masses of injured people who have no fault at all in what's taking place and are victims of horrendous genocide. And now here we are again, and we're using the self-same language, and we just have this really smug and satisfied look. The other thing about the courts, I think, which is significant and important, is there's precedence for this in the United States. I mean, after the American Civil War, in theory at least, because of 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, African Americans are supposed to be given through those amendments the same equal rights and protections under the law. Due process, jury trial, all this sort of stuff, right, which we lay out. But we resegregate the country, and the court system only works then based on if you can vote, right? Who's on a jury? Only people that are registered to vote. Well, if you just count African Americans, if you exclude them from being able to register to vote, then you're African American, you're accused of a crime, or in the case of a refugee, you're sitting before a judge supposedly of your peers who understands your situation. Same dynamic is at play. So there really is there's no empathetic court system if we're thinking that in some way justice is supposed to have some level of empathy. It didn't exist for African Americans in the late 19th and for most of the 20th century. And I don't think in any way, shape, or form we should think it exists for refugees and/or immigrants trying to come into the United States today. Okay.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to maybe touch on one more thing. Let's just skip straight to it. Based on, this idea of human rights and justice and the way that power plays into that, do we think that we have, a respectable immigration system?
I mean, it's all relative, I guess, right? The obvious answer seems to me to be no. But then one thing that a place like the United States can do is point to other, other sort of immigration policies throughout the world, and they're not much better either. So I think this is kind of
okay. So how do we stand on the world stage, and where do you think immigration policy needs to be, in general, in most places, but especially the United States?
That's a big question. I think obviously the United States, especially, thank you. the United States is not looked kindly upon throughout the world, and especially for the sorts of things that we've done recently, separating children from their parents, these sort of tactics that are done for the purpose, the explicit purpose of deterring immigrants from coming, and that's wrong on a couple of senses. I mean, for example, you're not supposed to do this for refugees. You can't make things so terrible that people don't want to exercise their human rights. And we all recognize that seeking asylum is a human right. And yet we create these policies that it's supposed to scare you off, to not even show up at the border and ask for immigration policy. Oh, sorry, for asylum. But what we could do at the very least would be sort of the things that Professor Forrant's talking about, which be we could just, in some sense, expand certain work visas, this would alleviate a lot of what people are demanding that we do. The other thing, though, is I think we focus a lot on what can we do to change the immigration policy, but there's a sense where a lot of the folks who are migrating are a symptom of some larger problems. One obvious one being climate change, other ones being the sorts of free trade agreements that we've done through other countries. We're making it so people no longer have the right to stay home. And I think what a lot of folks want to do is they want to be able to make a living, they would prefer to stay home. But a lot of this pressure for people migrating is that we create situations, as Professor Forrant was mentioning in the Middle East, where people just can't stay home.
So the United States directly create situations.
Well, through our policy and or through our consumption, right? And through the things that we do that cause
Globalistic forces.
Yeah, well, also the climate change that we've created has made it so people in Guatemala can't farm in the areas where they used to be able to farm anymore. The climate has completely changed in the Western Highlands.
And so America is responsible but not behaving accountably.
Correct, and it could be because we're also a couple steps removed, right? We don't actually see that it's all of us. It's our consumption that has created this change in climate, and these folks can no longer make a living where they could before. They have to move somewhere else.
Hens are coming home to roost, essentially.
And they are, and I think so. Part of the reason I'm resisting the way you're asking this question is it's not just if we just got the right immigration system, if we just got the right amount.
Definitely tear that question down. It was a bad question.
No, I didn't mean it that way. So I resist in the sense that the question's always, if we get just the right number of visas, this could be fixed. But I think it's a symptom of a larger problem.
Okay.
And I worry about giving a sort of a final answer to that because it's going to be much more complicated and harder for us.
I think that's a fair answer because it is a complicated question, and I gave you a really simplistic way of getting at it.
No, it's good.
No, so thank you both for coming and talking about this again. It's been wonderful to have both of your takes on it. That's about it for the time that we have today. And I hope everybody comes back and joins us for another episode of Crossover.